Hey Mark, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you this morning, Jer?
I'm doing well, thanks. So we are here again today, Fresh Takes with Dr. Wagner, here to take a look at some of the local health news and unpack some of that for you. Now, last week we talked about gut health overall. Dr. Wagner did mention uh, psychobiotics in passing. It was a topic that came up, and we've heard from the YouTube audience that we want to go into that a little bit deeper. So today we're here to dive into that topic. We've got a couple stories that we found. First on the BBC, headline is How Bacteria Are Changing Your Mood. Um, Interesting stuff about gut bacteria there. I will let Mark go into at depth. In a second article, a bit more sensational, the world's first psychobiotic food supplement could improve mood and memory. Mark, a couple of big ideas there. I'll let you take it from the top.
Yeah, I looked at these. You sent these to me just yesterday, and I was looking at over these, and I think backing up a bit and looking at this whole topic, really big macro lens for a second, because the truth is here, all probiotics could be construed as psychobiotics to some degree. In other words, all probiotics can be affecting our mood positively to some degree because good general gut health is associated with good general mental health. That's why I say that. I mean, we know that 61% of people with IBS, so irritable bowel syndrome, 61% of those people have DSM diagnosed anxiety disorders. And the interesting thing about that is that doctors will often get the cart before the horse there and mistake the cause for the effect. They'll see someone coming into their office complaining of irritable bowel syndrome, and they see they've also seen the psychiatrist and gotten a diagnosis of anxiety disorder, and they think, well, the reason you have irritable bowel syndrome is because you have an anxiety disorder. When the reality is probably the other way around. The reason you have an anxiety disorder is because you have IBS. And this is actually fairly apparent if you just look at the gastrointestinal effect on neurochemistry and the innervation of the gut itself, because there's a lot more information coming up from the body to the brain than there is from the brain going down to the gut. And we can see that in terms of just numbers. So, for example, the gut makes 90% of the serotonin in the body.
Wow.
Right there you have, yeah, right there you have, a compound highly associated with mood and depressive disorders. Most of a great deal of which is made in the gut. Now, whether all that makes across the blood-brain barrier is a different story. But here's something even more compelling: the vagus nerve, which is this long wandering nerve that innervates both the heart, the lungs, the entire GI tract, the GU tract, so the genital urinary tract, so the vagina, the all the mucosal surfaces, up the urinary canal and in the bladder, and then the mucosal surfaces of the lungs. So all these surfaces where bugs are going to be, and particularly in the gut. This nerve is what we call an 80% afferent fibers. So 80% of the fibers in the vagus nerve are afferent. That means they are on approach, A for approach. They are on approach to the brain. They are sending messages from these organs to the brain, and only 20% of those fibers are descending, efferent, so exiting, E for exit, exiting the brain and going down. So 80% of the information conveyed by the vagus nerve, one of the largest nerves in the body, innervating all of these microbiome-rich organs, 80% of that information is coming up from the body to the brain. So for me, it's no surprise why 61% of people with irritable bowel syndrome also have an anxiety diagnosis, a full-out anxiety disorder, like a formal disorder. And I think that the relationship is mostly, even though it's bidirectional, it's mostly from the bottom up, not from the top down. So that's why I say all probiotics are psychobiotics to some degree, because good general gut health is associated with good general mental health. Now, that being said, there are a few strains out there, more every day, that are being studied that seem to have a disproportionate effect on mental health in relatively small amounts. Now, because usually what we think of in terms of a really robust probiotic is something that's like 50 billion colony forming units or more. But it turns out there are certain strains that have been identified which have effects at much lower thresholds, and that is what is being called, that's where we get the term psychobiotics. These are very specific, not just genus and species, but specific strains. So that's where these articles come in. So I think now we can actually start really talking about psychobiotics proper in the context of this larger connection between the gut health and mental health. So do you have any questions about that before we move on?
No, it's fascinating though.
Yeah, it is fascinating, and we're not going to by any means exhaust this topic today. It's going to be something we will return to over and over again because the science is evolving pretty rapidly. I often joke that the more I know, the less I know about what can be known, because the rate at which information is coming out of science far outstrips any one person's ability to assimilate it. So the more you know, the less you know about what can be known, because the
yeah, you get the map of the whole, and you realize you're a piece of it.
Yeah. So this is this is just one super exciting area of exploding knowledge in science. So I wanted to comment a little bit on some of the hype that I saw in the Mirror article. I don't know. I'm not familiar with UK publications, but my sense is that that this particular publication is probably a little more tabloidy, a little more sensational, because I mean they're claiming here, for example, that this is the world's first psychobiotic food supplement, when in fact it's not the world's first. There are lots of psychobiotic supplements on the market already. Maybe it's the first in the UK, but at least in the United States, I know of several psychobiotic supplements off the top of my head. They're well formulated. Dr. Perlmutter, whom I've referenced before, has, he works with Garden of Life, and they have several known psychobiotic strains in their formulations. And then there's a Natural Stacks is a company that has a product called Brain Biotic with 4 well-studied psychobiotic strains in it. So clearly, whatever the Mirror is referencing here, this product called, what's it called? Zenflora. Clearly, it's not the first.
Yeah, I wonder if this is even like a sponsored type article featuring that.
Yeah, one of those sponsored articles. So, but I think it's important to comment on that for our viewers, because for the layperson, this is how they're going to be encountering this information. Okay. All right. So, and I'm looking here at the strain that they studied. It's Bifidobacterium longum 1714, and the 1714 refers to the actual strain. So, if you remember back to your high school biology class, all living things have 2 names, a genus and a species. We are Homo sapiens. Well, in the plant, fungi, and bacterial kingdoms, there are lots of strains that go beyond that. So it's like another layer of bifurcation. So you have your genus, your species, and then your strains. And it turns out these strains can be actually quite important. So these are things to look for, that our listeners and viewers should be aware of, that it's not just the genus and species that makes a probiotic a psychobiotic proper. It's the exact strain that's been studied in the literature. So you need to look for those numbers that come behind there, and get on Google Scholar and look and see if those have actually been studied. Yeah. So so in this case, this Bifidobacter longum 1714, findings were published apparently in the Journal of, what is it here? I'm looking here. The Journal of Translational Psychiatry in 2016, and it had what's called anxiolytic effects. So these are decreasing anxiety effects, okay? But this is really similar to other strains that have been well vetted. Some strains of Lactobacillus rhamnosus, for example, completely different genus, completely different species, and also a specific strain. I'm trying to look at. Yeah, well, this is not even a cousin. This would be like a whole different. This is widely unrelated. So this would be Lactobacillus rhamnosus R0011. So that's the strain. So you can see how complex this gets very quickly. So that's why I'm driving home this point. You've got a genus, you've got a species, and then you've got a strain number, and you need to look up the whole thing on Google Scholar to make sure that the strains that you're looking at actually have some clinical data behind them. So, I mean, some good ones just off the top of my head are Lactobacillus helveticus, R0052, Lactobacillus plantarum, R1012, Lactobacillus brevis, HA-112. We'll put these in the show notes. Lactobacillus rhamnosus, R0011, already mentioned that, and Bifidobacterium longum, R0175. So, but there are more, and then there are combinations of these that have been studied. I was looking around, and there are specific combinations where there seem to be some synergistic benefit in studies where you have Lactobacillus species paired together, or Lactobacillus species plus Bifidobacterium species. So it's really outside the scope of something anybody's gonna be able to follow in this format, all these different combinations, let alone all these different strains. So what I want to communicate today is that when you look at something that's claiming to be a psychobiotic, what you need to look at is the genus name, the species name, and the strain designation number, and then go to Google Scholar and find something on PubMed that shows that this at least has good animal model data, preferably also some clinical trials in humans, okay? Now, let's back up again and say and look at just some plausible mechanisms of why these critters are having an effect on our mood, like why specific strains. Well, we already talked about the link at the vagus nerve and how 80% of the fibers are on approach to the brain. They are afferent, they are on approach. But there's also certain byproducts of fermentation and processing, metabolic processing that these critters do in our gut that creates totally novel compounds that we absorb that were not in the food we ate. Okay, so the food you eat has certain chemical characteristics, but after it gets processed by this vast unsupervised chemical processing plant in your gut, you can come up with entirely different compounds. And they can have neurologic effects. For example, one of the favorite byproducts of a lot of bacteria that are breaking down fiber in your gut is a short chain fatty acid called butyrate. Well, it turns out that in studies, high butyrate concentrations are helpful in alleviating symptoms of depression. So here you have a direct mechanistic explanation of how some of even just the common byproducts of these fiber digesting bugs have on producing a chemical whose side effect on the brain is an antidepressant. So that's fascinating, and that's a real argument to having a wide variety of fiber in your diet, so you're feeding those good bugs so that those populations go up. The other big impact of microbiome and specific bugs and mixes of bugs is that the microbiome in your gut influences your immune system to a huge degree. And this also, we've talked about this in terms of like a leaky gut. If your gut is leaky, even the good bugs can be alarming to the immune system. So you have to have good fences, make good neighbors, especially in the gut. And then the types of neighbors you have, well, they can be good or bad neighbors. And so the good neighbors are producing chemicals that kind of soothe the immune system, if you will, and keep you from going into these sort of cytokine storms of inflammation, because it turns out there's a big link between systemic inflammation and neurocognitive effects, especially mood. So there's a large category of depression that probably is just a side effect of systemic inflammation. So keep that in mind. And then we have emerging evidence that some of these gut bugs are using these tiny little strips of genetic code called microRNAs to actually alter the DNA workings in your nerve cells. Right? So clearly we have a lot of work to do here in science. We have a lot of really great scientific hypotheses here, and not nearly as many great scientific conclusions, but we're getting there. So stay tuned for all of that. The other major point we need to make here is that these psychobiotics, and in probiotics in general this is true, it's a little bit of a myth that you can re-inoculate yourself and have those bugs actually take root in your system. So I talked last week about the 4R protocol, which was remove, replace, re-inoculate, repair. And there is a growing body of research that is kind of saying these bugs don't actually stick around that long like we hope they do. You kind of have to keep taking them. And the reason for that is probably a phenomenon known as colonization resistance. And that is, you can think of it if you have like a really old growth forest with lots of trees that have already grown up and taken up the light. It's hard to plant things down below that are going to take root. Now, you could bring something in that you like, let's say some cut stem roses or something, and you could walk through the forest, and the molecules, you'd still be able to smell the scent of rose there for a while until the rose completely died. But you're not going to be able to grow the rose because it's not going to get enough. The microclimate is wrong. So that's kind of how you think about probiotics these days. And really, the only way we know of to get a really robust growth and established colonies of new microbes in the gut, the only way we know of that really works well is to transplant the entire ecosystem, and that is a fecal microbial transplant.
I've read about athletes that are experimenting with that.
Yeah. So when you transplant the entire ecosystem, then it sort of takes root. So we know that. Unfortunately, the only FDA approved use of that currently in the United States is for severe cases of C. diff, colitis, which is a life-threatening disorder, but has a 90% response rate to fecal microbial transplants, and it doesn't really respond to much else. So there are other areas of the world where they're experimenting with FMT for things like autism and obesity. Yeah, because it turns out a lot of these psychobiotics, the initial research and hypotheses were generated using mice, or these called germ-free mice, where they would take a mouse and they would keep it hermetically sealed from the world, and so that it never got inoculated with any sort of its mother's microbiome or any other microbiome, so that the gut was germ-free. There were no germs in there. And what they found is these mice, given any particular stressful stimulus, were much more anxious than the mice that had an intact microbiome, indicating in fact that the microbiome has a modulating effect on how we handle stress, probably because of all of these compounds that are elaborated down there, like butyrate and others that we've already discussed that assist with serotonin and GABA and all kinds of things in the brain. So in addition to that, other animal models showed that you could take rats with depressive symptoms, as measured by lack of engagement and certain behaviors, and you could transplant their microbiome. So you could do a fecal microbial transplant from the depressed mice into the non-depressed mice, and then they would start behaving just like the depressed mice. And you could do it with anxiety as well. So you could induce these states of mind that we thought previously were just states of mind, and you could induce them by changing the microflora of the gut. So it was almost like, in a sense, depression and anxiety were almost communicable diseases. And I don't want anybody to come away from that and thinking that I can catch this from somebody, because no, you can't, because of the phenomenon we just talked about, the colonization resistance. You would have to have like a full-out fecal microbial transplant to have that be the case. But what you can do is induce huge napalm events in your gut by taking large dose of antibiotics or lots of enemas that are that reduce the number of bugs in your gut by 5x, and things like that are going to decimate your ecology, that old growth forest, to the point where now you become vulnerable to new bugs taking root that may not be helpful, and those are major things you can do to majorly disrupt it. But minor things that disrupt it a lot over time is just our processed food supply. And we can talk another time about how much glyphosate is getting into our food and poisoning the microbiome. Glyphosate, Roundup, as you may or may not have heard, was first noted not as a weed killer, but as an antimicrobial. So it's an antibiotic. And we're using it, at least in North America, so Canada and the United States, we're using it as a desiccant for lots of crops, wheat, barley, oats, legumes are being sprayed not to control weeds or anything, but just to dry them out quickly so that you can get the harvest done before these snowstorms, particularly in the north. But what that does is that coats them with this antibiotic, and it gets into the milled flowers and everything. So we're actually ingesting on a regular basis pretty high doses of antibiotics in the form of glyphosate, let alone all the stuff that's prescribed. And there's so much of it in the environment now, it's actually cross-contaminating a lot of the organic products. So this is a big issue, and I think one of the reasons why we're getting so sick and so many mental disorders and why anxiety and depression is on the rise is not just because we live in a more stressful society with social media and all that, and that may all be true, but I think that given the amount of information that's coming from the gut to the brain, I think the things we're doing to destroy gut health are having a huge knock-on effect to our mental health, and we are only just beginning to understand. And psychobiotics may help us out a little bit, but there's a much bigger conversation we need to be having. And I think that's really all I have to say about this topic. It's getting long.
Yeah, no, that's all fascinating stuff, and yeah, thanks for that. I know we'll cover off more on gut health overall and probiotics and all that stuff. So thanks a lot, Mark. Appreciate it, and we'll be back next week.
Hey, you're welcome. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.